3 days. That's how long the wheelchair lasted in my daughter's room before my mother-in-law called a donation truck and gave it away, while my daughter was taking her afternoon nap in the next room, completely unaware. I had saved for 11 months to buy that chair. I had skipped my own physical therapy, sold my grandmother's ring, and worked a second shift at the diner every Friday night just to afford it. And when I asked my mother-in-law why she did it, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "I was helping." That thing was an eyesore in a family that already has enough weighing it down. My husband told me I was overreacting. That was the night I stopped being quiet. My name is Sable Winters, and before I tell you what I did about the wheelchair, I need you to understand what came before it, because none of this happened out of nowhere. Cruelty like this builds slowly, one small comment at a time, until it becomes the air a family breathes without noticing. I live in a small coastal town in Oregon, the kind of place where the fog rolls in off the water every morning and everyone knows everyone's business by lunchtime. My husband, Holt Bennington, and I bought a modest blue house 3 streets back from the harbor when we got married, the kind of house with a porch swing and a garden I never had time to tend. We had our daughter, Marigold, 2 years later. She was born with a condition affecting her spinal development. Cerebral palsy, the doctors said, though no diagnosis ever really captures a whole person. By the time she was 7, she used a wheelchair full-time. Over the next few years, she also learned something no child should ever have to learn, how to apologize for taking up space in a room. That second part is the part that still keeps me up at night. Holt's mother, Odessa Croft, never wanted grandchildren who weren't, in her words, easy. She said it once at a Thanksgiving dinner when Marigold was 5, not realizing or not caring that Marigold was sitting right there, quiet as always, pushing peas around her plate. Odessa had said it to her sister on the phone in the kitchen, thinking no one could hear. The girl's sweet, but Holt could have had it easier. A healthy grandchild who could carry the family name forward properly. I stood in the hallway holding a stack of dinner plates and felt something in my chest go cold and hard, like a stone dropped into still water. I confronted her that night. She laughed it off, said I was too sensitive, said I didn't understand what it meant to want the best for a family's future. Holt, when I told him, sighed and said his mother didn't mean it the way it sounded. That became the pattern. Odessa would say something devastating, I would raise it, and Holt would smooth it over like a crease in a tablecloth, as though the wrinkle had never been real to begin with. Over the years, the comments never stopped. They just got quieter, more surgical. Odessa stopped saying cruel things in front of Marigold directly. She was too careful for that, too calculating. Instead, she said them just loud enough. Dead weight was her favorite phrase, and she used it so often that I started hearing it in my sleep. The family's dead weight. She said it about the cost of Marigold's medical equipment. She said it about the ramp Holt built onto the porch, which she called an ugly scar on a beautiful house. She said it about vacations we couldn't take because airports weren't always accessible, framing it as Marigold holding everyone back. Marigold heard more than any of us realized. Kids always do. One evening, not long after she turned 8, she asked me while I was tucking her into bed, "Mom, am I dead weight?" I remember the exact color of the lamplight in her room, amber and soft, and how it did nothing to soften the blow of that sentence. I told her no, of course not, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to me. But I saw something shift in her that night, a small crack in the foundation of how she saw herself. After that, she started saying sorry constantly. Sorry for needing help getting her coat on. Sorry for asking to stop at the accessible restroom during long drives. Sorry for existing in spaces that weren't built with her in mind. My daughter, at 8 years old, had learned to treat her own needs as inconveniences to be apologized for. There's one memory from that period I still can't shake, even now. Marigold's 9th birthday party was held at our house, a small gathering with a handful of school friends and family. Odessa arrived late, carrying a gift bag and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. When it came time for cake, Marigold's old wheelchair got stuck on the transition between the kitchen tile and the living room carpet, a small lip in the flooring that had never been properly leveled. She struggled for a moment, embarrassed, her friends watching. Before I could cross the room to help her, Odessa said, loudly enough for the whole party to hear, "Well, this is exactly why I said a big party wasn't a good idea. Too much fuss for a house that isn't set up for it." The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone senses something wrong but no one knows how to name it. Marigold's friends, 9 and 10 years old, didn't understand the cruelty embedded in the comment, but they understood the tone, and they understood that their friend had suddenly become the reason for an adult's irritation. Marigold turned red, apologized to the room, and asked if we could skip the cake and just do presents instead, clearly wanting the moment to end as quickly as possible. I remember kneeling beside her wheelchair, lifting the small wool over the lip in the flooring myself, my hands shaking with a fury I didn't yet have language for, while Odessa sipped her coffee across the room as though nothing had happened at all. I raised it with Holt more than once. He loved his mother. That part one understood. But love should never come at the cost of your child's sense of worth. Holt would always say the same thing. She's from a different generation. She doesn't know how it sounds. I started to wonder if he genuinely believed that, or if it was simply easier than confronting the woman who raised him. 3 years passed. By the time Marigold turned 11, her old wheelchair had become a genuine problem. It was a hand-me-down from a hospital equipment exchange, heavy, difficult to maneuver, and too small for her growing frame. Her physical therapist warned that continuing to use it could cause posture issues and worsen her mobility long-term. A properly fitted, lightweight chair with better support would cost close to $9,000, and insurance would only cover a fraction of that. I decided I would find the rest myself, without telling Holt how much I was sacrificing to do it, because I didn't want it to become another thing Odessa could twist into a grievance about money spent on extras. I picked up every shift the diner would give me. I sold jewelry I'd inherited, including my grandmother's wedding ring, which I told myself I would buy back one day, though I never really believed that. I skipped my own physical therapy appointments for a shoulder injury from years of lifting Marigold in and out of the tub, telling myself I could deal with the pain later. 11 months. 11 months of quiet, invisible sacrifice, until I finally had enough. The day the new wheelchair arrived, Marigold cried. Not the sad kind of crying, the kind where joy is too big for a body to hold quietly. It was a deep plum purple, her favorite color, custom-fitted, light enough that she could push herself independently for the first time in years. She named it Comet, because she said it made her feel like she could finally move as fast as she wanted to. For the first time in a long while, I watched my daughter move through our house like it fully belonged to her. 3 days later, I came home from a closing shift at the diner to find the garage door open and Comet gone. At first, I thought Holt had taken it somewhere for an adjustment. Then I saw Marigold's face when she when she was being carried by her father, out to greet me, because her old, ill-fitting chair was also missing, replaced temporarily by nothing but Holt's arms. My stomach dropped before anyone said a word. Odessa had come by that afternoon while Holt was at work and I was at the diner, using the spare key she still had from house-sitting years earlier. She told our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Fenwick, that she was doing the family a favor and had a donation truck from a local charity come collect what she called unnecessary clutter from the garage. Comet, a $9,000 custom wheelchair, 3 days old, was loaded onto that truck along with a stack of old blankets and a broken lamp. I called the charity organization immediately, frantic, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. They were kind, but apologetic. Once items were logged and sorted, tracking a specific item within hours was nearly impossible, especially medical equipment that could be redistributed same day to another family in urgent need. There was no guarantee. There was no simple undo button for what had just happened. When I confronted Odessa on the phone, her voice didn't waver even slightly. I was helping, she said. That thing was an eyesore in a family that already has enough weighing it down. Dead weight. Always dead weight. As if my daughter's mobility, her independence, her joy, was clutter to be tidied away for the comfort of people who never had to sacrifice a single thing for it. I hung up and turned to Holt, expecting him to be as devastated as I was. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck and said the words that broke something in me permanently. Sable, I know you're upset, but I think you're overreacting a little. She didn't mean any harm. We'll figure something out with insurance. It's not like Marigold's stuck without a chair. She's got the old one. The old one. The one her physical therapist said was actively harming her posture. The one that was too small for her body. The one that made her arms ache after 20 minutes of pushing herself anywhere. I looked at my husband, a man I had loved for 13 years, and understood something with total clarity for the first time. He had spent our entire marriage treating his mother's cruelty as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a wound to be healed. And now, faced with the single most devastating thing anyone had ever done to our daughter, his first instinct was still to protect his mother's comfort over his own child's dignity. That night, after Marigold finally fell asleep, exhausted from crying and from the physical strain of using her old chair all day, I sat at our kitchen table and made a decision. I was done being quiet. I was done letting people smooth over cruelty with the word overreacting. If no one else in this family was going to protect my daughter, I would build something no one could quietly take away again. Not the chair itself, but the ground beneath her. The next morning, I started making calls. My first call was to a disability rights attorney named Thessaly Kirkbride, who specialized in cases involving medical equipment and family disputes. She listened to the entire story without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that steadied me more than I expected. What happened to your daughter isn't just thoughtless. Depending on how the donation was processed, and depending on ownership of the equipment, there may be legal grounds here. But more importantly, you need documentation, and you need boundaries that don't depend on your husband's willingness to enforce them. My second call was to the medical equipment supplier who had built Comet. I explained what happened, half expecting to be told it was a total loss. Instead, the representative, a patient man named Osric, told me something that gave me the first real flicker of hope I'd felt in days. Custom chairs built to a specific prescription were harder to resell than standard models, since they were fitted to one person's exact measurements. If the donation center hadn't already redistributed it, there was a real chance it was still sitting in inventory unclaimed. I spent the next 6 hours calling every donation center and secondhand medical supply outlet within 100 miles, describing Comet down to the smallest detail: the plum purple frame, the custom footrest angle, a small constellation sticker Marigold had placed near the wheel. Most calls ended the same discouraging way. Polite voices explaining that medical equipment, especially anything usable, tended to move quickly, sometimes within hours of being logged, because the need for affordable mobility equipment in our region far outpaced supply. One coordinator gently suggested I consider filing an insurance claim for a replacement instead of chasing something that was likely already gone, her voice kind but resigned, clearly used to delivering this particular kind of disappointment to families like mine. I refused to let myself accept that answer. Somewhere between the fourth and fifth call, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad full of crossed-out phone numbers, I thought about Marigold naming that chair Comet, about the exact sound of her laugh the first time she pushed herself down our hallway without anyone's help. I was not going to explain to my daughter that the one thing that had ever made her feel entirely capable was simply gone, replaced by paperwork and a waiting period for a claim that could take months to process. On the fourth call, a woman at a regional donation center in the next county paused and said, "Actually, I think we might have that one." She explained that because it was a custom pediatric chair with a rare plum purple frame, one of the staff had remembered logging it in that same morning, since chairs like that almost never came through their intake room. I drove 2 hours that same afternoon, my hands gripping the steering wheel, so tightly my knuckles went white the entire way. And there, sitting in a warehouse aisle between a stack of folded walkers and a box of unlabeled cushions, was Comet. Untouched. Unclaimed. Waiting. I won't pretend the tears I cried in that warehouse were graceful. I sat down right there on the concrete floor and sobbed, partly from relief and partly from the sheer exhaustion of everything it had taken to get there. But finding the chair again wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the part that actually mattered. When I got home, I didn't scream at Odessa. I didn't scream at Holt either, though every part of me wanted to. Instead, I did something far more effective. I documented everything. I wrote out a full timeline of the years of comments, the pattern of behavior, cross-referenced with dates I remembered and, where possible, corroborated by witnesses like Mrs. Fenwick, who had overheard both the deadweight comment years earlier and the day of the donation truck. I gathered the purchase receipt for Comet, proof that it had been bought and paid for exclusively with money I had earned independently. I met with Thessaly again and learned that because the wheelchair had been purchased solely by me, with my own separate savings, and because Odessa had entered our home without current permission using an outdated spare key, there were real, tangible consequences available to us, both legal and otherwise. Then I sat Holt down for the conversation I had been avoiding out of exhaustion for years. I told him that I loved him, and that I understood loving his mother was not something I could simply demand he stop doing. But I told him, in the clearest words I had ever used with him, that his silence over the years had not been neutral. Every time he smoothed over a cruel comment instead of naming it, he had taught both his mother and his daughter something. He had taught Odessa that there would be no real consequence for her cruelty. And he had taught Marigold that her own father would not stand between her and the person hurting her. I told him I needed him to choose, not in a dramatic ultimatum sense, but in the quiet daily sense of who he chose to protect when it actually cost him something. For the first time in years, Holt didn't immediately defend his mother. He sat with what I said for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since Marigold's difficult birth. He said he had spent his whole life trying not to upset his mother because his own childhood had been shaped by her disappointment whenever anyone challenged her. He admitted painfully that it had been easier to ask me to absorb her cruelty than to confront a pattern that stretched back before I ever entered his life. It wasn't a full redemption in that one conversation. Real change rarely happens in a single night. But it was the first honest thing he had said about his mother in 13 years of marriage, and it was a start. Before that confrontation happened, though, something else surfaced that changed the entire shape of the story, and I think it's the part that matters most, because it revealed that the wheelchair was never really about the wheelchair at all. While gathering documentation with Thessaly, we requested records from the donation center to establish a clear timeline of when the chair had been dropped off and logged. Buried in the intake paperwork was a small detail that initially seemed irrelevant. The donation had been logged not as a general household item, but specifically flagged under medical equipment and used. When I asked the center why it had been categorized that way, the coordinator told me that whoever dropped it off had specifically described it to the intake staff as brand new, never actually needed by the family, purchased impulsively. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Odessa hadn't simply seen an old, cluttered wheelchair sitting in a garage and decided to clean up. She had looked at a brand new, custom-fitted chair, understood exactly what it was and what it cost, and chosen, deliberately, to describe it to strangers as something impulsive and unnecessary, erasing 11 months of sacrifice in a single sentence to a stranger behind a donation counter. It got worse. Mrs. Fenwick, our elderly neighbor, mentioned something almost in passing when I stopped by to thank her for her willingness to speak on Marigold's behalf. She said that a few days before the donation truck arrived, Odessa had come by her porch for tea and mentioned, rather pointedly, that Holt and I were spoiling that girl into helplessness by investing so much in equipment instead of encouraging her to push through using willpower alone. Mrs. Fenwick, uncomfortable, had changed the subject at the time and hadn't thought much of it until she connected it to what happened days later. That was when I understood the donation hadn't been a spontaneous, thoughtless mistake at all. It had been a decision, made in advance, dressed up afterward as an accident because I was helping sounded far more sympathetic than the truth. Odessa hadn't stumbled onto an eyesore in a garage. She had planned in some quiet, deliberate corner of her mind to remove something she personally disapproved of, and she had used the word accidentally as a shield the moment she got caught. I brought this new information to Holt before the family meeting, and I watched something in his expression change permanently. He had been willing, up to that point, to believe his mother capable of a genuinely careless mistake. He was not prepared to accept that she had planned it, spoken about it in advance to a neighbor, and then lied to our faces about the nature of what she'd done. For the first time, I watched him get angry on our daughter's behalf rather than anxious on his mother's behalf, and something in me, some tired, worn-down part that had been carrying this alone for years, finally exhaled. Before any family conversation happened, Thessaly sent Odessa a formal letter on firm letterhead, calmly outlining the facts as we understood them. Entry into her home without updated permission. Removal and donation of medical equipment belonging to a minor without any family member's consent. A documented pattern of statements that a family court could reasonably interpret as ongoing emotional harm to a disabled child, should the matter ever need to be raised formally regarding guardianship or supervised contact. It wasn't a threat exactly. Thessaly told me, more of a mirror, a way of showing Odessa, in writing, exactly how her behavior would read to someone outside the family. The letter did what shouting never could. Odessa called Holt within a day of receiving it, her voice tight and unfamiliar, asking to meet in person to clear the air. We agreed, but on our terms this time, at a neutral coffee shop near Thessaly's office rather than in our home. When Odessa arrived, her usual confidence was noticeably absent. She tried her familiar deflections at first, that she was being dramatic, that this was a private family matter being blown out of proportion, that no one would actually care about a donated wheelchair. But without an audience to perform for, and without the comfort of our living room, the words seemed to lose their power, even as she said them. The pattern was the issue, not any single incident, and patterns, once written down plainly enough, tend to speak for themselves. We didn't pursue a courtroom battle in the end, and I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story about explosive, dramatic revenge. It's a story about boundaries finally being enforced instead of endlessly excused. Holt, standing beside me for the first time in this fight rather than in front of his mother, told Odessa plainly that unsupervised access to our home and our daughter was no longer something she would have. Visits going forward would happen on our terms, in our presence, and any comment resembling dead weight or its many quiet cousins would end the visit immediately. No negotiation, no smoothing over. Odessa was furious. She accused us of turning her own son against her, of being ungrateful for everything she'd done for the family over the years. But something had changed permanently in that room. For the first time, her fury didn't reshape the outcome. It simply existed, ignored, while the new boundary stood firm around it. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something I hadn't expected. Holt began doing small things he had never done before, things that told me the shift wasn't just performative for my benefit. He started attending Marigold's physical therapy appointments, instead of assuming I had it handled. He researched adaptive sports programs in our area on his own and found a wheelchair basketball league 2 towns over that Marigold ended up loving. He began correcting his own coworkers when they made careless comments about disability in passing conversation, something he told me he'd never had the nerve to do before, always worried about seeming difficult. It wasn't a single dramatic transformation. It was 100 small corrections, the kind that add up over months into something resembling real change. There was one more moment I want to share, because it's the one that told me we had truly turned a corner. Odessa called about 6 weeks after the confrontation, asking to see Marigold for her birthday. Holt took the call, and I listened from the next room, half expecting him to soften the way he always had. Instead, he told his mother that a visit was possible, but only under the terms we had already established, and only if she was willing to sit down beforehand and genuinely apologize to Marigold directly, in language a 9-year-old could understand, without qualifiers or excuses folded into it. Odessa hesitated for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then, quietly, she agreed. The apology, when it came, wasn't perfect. Odessa's voice was stiff, clearly uncomfortable with vulnerability in a way that had probably been true her entire life. But she looked Marigold in the eye and said she had been wrong, that Marigold's chair was not Clutter, that Marigold herself had never been a burden, and that she was sorry for ever making her feel otherwise. Marigold, cautious but hopeful in the way only children can be, accepted it. I didn't fully trust it yet, and I told Holt as much afterward. He agreed. Trust, he said, would have to be rebuilt through consistency over time, not granted the moment the right words were finally spoken. We agreed to keep the boundaries in place regardless, because an apology, however sincere, doesn't undo a pattern. Only sustained, different behavior does that. Marigold got Comet back exactly 1 week after it disappeared. I remember wheeling it into her room myself, watching her face light up the same way it had the very first day. But this time something else had changed too. I sat on the edge of her bed and told her, honestly, age-appropriately, that what happened wasn't her fault, that her grandmother's words over the years had been wrong, every single time, and that needing help, needing equipment, needing space in the world, never once made a person less valuable. I told her the word sorry was not something she owed anyone for existing exactly as she was. It took months for her to stop apologizing reflexively for small, ordinary things. Some days, even now, I catch the old habit creeping back in, a flinch before asking for help reaching something, a quiet sorry, before requesting a break during a long outing. But it happens far less than it used to, and every time it does, I gently remind her that she owes no apology for taking up exactly the space she deserves. Holt and Odessa's relationship has not fully healed, and I'm not sure it ever fully will, at least not in the way it once was. She still calls occasionally, and Holt still speaks with her, but the boundary holds. She has not been alone with Marigold since that week, and she has never again used that phrase in our home. Whether that change came from genuine reflection or simple fear of consequence, I honestly can't say. But the outcome, for my daughter's sake, is the same either way. She is safe. She is protected. And for the first time, her own father made sure of it, rather than leaving that job entirely to me. A year has passed since the day I found Comet sitting in that warehouse aisle. Marigold is 10 now, and she plays wheelchair basketball on Wednesday evenings with a fierce competitiveness that still catches me off guard, given how quiet and apologetic she used to be about taking up space in a room. Her coach, a retired athlete named Everett who lost the use of his legs in his 20s, told me during one practice that Marigold has one of the sharpest competitive instincts he's coached in years, once she stopped shrinking herself to fit other people's comfort. Watching her race down that court, elbows out, unapologetic, I understand now that the version of my daughter who used to say sorry for existing was never the true version of her. That was a version cruelty had built, one comment at a time, and it took just as much patience, one moment at a time, to dismantle it. Holt and I are different now too, in ways I don't think either of us expected. Our marriage isn't perfect, and I won't pretend that 13 years of a certain dynamic reversed overnight simply because of one hard conversation. But we talk now, really talk, about the patterns we both grew up with and the ones we don't want to hand down to Marigold. He still calls his mother, and I've made peace with that, because I understand now that boundaries were never about erasing Odessa from our lives entirely. They were about making sure her comfort could never again outweigh our daughter's dignity in this family's decisions. I think about the word overreacting often too, almost as much as I think about dead weight. I've come to believe it's one of the most quietly damaging phrases a person can use against someone trying to protect a child, because it doesn't attack the pain directly. It attacks the size of the pain, shrinking it down until the person feeling it starts to doubt whether it was ever real to begin with. I spent years doubting my own reaction to things that deserved far more than doubt. I won't do that again, not for Odessa, not for anyone. A few weeks ago, we were at the grocery store, and Marigold's wheelchair bumped gently into a display of canned soup, knocking 2 cans onto the floor. An older woman nearby turned, startled by the noise, and Marigold opened her mouth, the old reflex rising in her the way it sometimes still does. But instead of the automatic apology I braced myself for, she simply picked up the cans, set them back on the shelf herself, and said calmly, "Sorry, that happens sometimes." Then, almost to herself, quiet enough that only I heard it, she added, "I don't have to say sorry for existing anymore." I had to turn away and pretend to study a shelf of pasta so she wouldn't see me cry in the middle of a grocery store aisle. I think about that phrase sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet. Dead weight. As if love, care, and sacrifice for someone you cherish could ever be measured that way. As if a child's worth could be calculated by convenience. My daughter is not dead weight. She never was. She is the reason I learned exactly how far I would go, and exactly how loudly I would eventually choose to speak, for the people who cannot always speak loudly for themselves. So I'll leave you with this question, because I think about it often, and I suspect some of you might have your own answer. If someone in your family treated the person you loved most as an inconvenience for years, and everyone around you kept asking you to stay quiet about it, how long would you wait before you finally stopped?